Today's show is the psychology of men's issues beyond toxicity. This podcast has been developed with the intent to inform and educate the general public and providers and should not be relied upon for any other purpose. The content, views, and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speaker and not those of the San Diego Psychological Association. Welcome to the San Diego Psychological Association's podcast, Diving into Healing. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Carcel. Dr. Singley is a San Diego-based board-certified psychologist and the director of the Center for Men's Excellence. His research focus and practice on men's mental health issues, with a particular emphasis on reproductive psychology and the transition to fatherhood, is something of a specialty. Thank you so much, Dr. Singley, for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me and for fluffing me up with that introduction. I'm like, wow, that dude sounds impressive.
Well, you are definitely specializing in something that I think is so significant and important. It's interesting when we talk about psychology and clinical psychology, it's so important to keep diversity in mind. And, men and men's issues has not been addressed, I think, to the level that, we focus so much on clinical work and different facets of psychology. So I'm curious, what made you interested to specialize in working with fatherhood and with men and men's issues?
So it goes back to the old sort of research is me search thing. And when I first started grad school, actually what I was looking to focus on was white racial identity development. And, I'm a white guy, and commonly that's an invisible aspect of identity to white people, especially to white men. So I ended up focusing less on that, but certainly included that as a facet of some of the different research and clinical work that I did. I certainly did a lot of soul searching and had our first son. My wife was pregnant with him when I went on internship. And it was around that time that my own sense of masculinity through the lens of expectant and then new fatherhood really became super salient to me. And so, like a good psychologist, I hit the literature and started nerding out on early fatherhood stuff and men's issues. Really, what firmed this up is a local psychologist and good friend and mentor of mine, Jeff Jones. He came to talk to my intern class at UC San Diego. This was back when CAPS had an internship program. And Jeff came and talked about the psychology of men and men's issues and the work that he was doing with new and expectant dads. I had a 3-week-old baby at the time, and it blew my mind. Like, no, literally throughout all my doctoral studies, no one had, like, I took gender. We didn't talk about masculinity ever. Gender nonconforming, transgender, lots of stuff on women, nothing about men or masculinities. And Jeff just blew my mind. Got his info, finished up postdocing, and then kind of cold called him and said, hey man, I basically mentor me, show me the way. And he did, and pulled me into, actually one of the very first things that he did was get me into the SDPA's men's issues committee. He was like, don't try to do this all yourself. We have other people that are interested and involved. Did that. And also made the introduction into the APA's Division 51 on men and masculinities. The more that I did that, the more authentic I was. Like, it's no real secret that I'm fairly ADD, and I have the energy component that goes along with that. So I can do more than your average person because I just flat out have the energy to do it. But right when I left grad school and was starting to get involved in really professional work, I was fairly scattered. Like, I was doing online methodologies in psychology research, still doing the white racial identity stuff, the positive psychology, strengths-based work, fatherhood, was also working, a 40-hour job. And at some point, after doing work at a couple of different startups, my wife took me aside and basically gave me the rolled up newspaper to the nose and said, you have to knock it off. You have to only do stuff about fatherhood and men's issues. And so whatever it is, whatever the research project is, whatever the committee is, you got to let it go and really focus on the men's issues and fatherhood stuff. And I never looked back. And it's some of the best mentoring, aside from what I got from Jeff, that I've ever gotten. So that's kind of what got me here.
I love to hear that you had a mentor in that way and that Jeff was so inspirational, but that, it takes our partners too, right? Sometimes to just help us and give us that opportunity to say, hey, this is what I see is the right direction, or it just feels, like where you're going. And you've really taken off with this. You're an expert in the field. The issues that you're addressing really resonate for everyone right now. It's not just for men, specifically the toxicity part, male toxicity or this topic in general. It's so relevant in recent times. And, we've been talking about multiple topics when it comes to this specific toxicity and masculine toxicity. And, we're talking now about topics we haven't discussed, in major outlets and in media about gaslighting and, feeling these men talking over women, for example, or, even with gender diversity. I'm curious, how would you describe, men's toxicity, and what does this mean? Like, what does this represent? And how do we go about openly talking about it and even working with someone who identifies with it?
All right, that's about 6 questions in one, and they're all really good ones.
Yeah, your ADD can handle them.
Believe me, I've got them all sorted out. Just to the first bit about toxic masculinity. One of the things that's actually very difficult for me at this point is that if you do like a quick, hey, let's do a quick implicit association, masculinity, toxic tends to get just filled in tacitly as you go.
Yep.
Which is understandable for a lot of reasons, for a lot of long history of a lot of men behaving in self-destructive and poor ways, which thankfully I think masculinity is under construction and beginning to turn around. I'll have more to say about that. It's interesting in the current context of Time's Up and Me Too, and certainly greater attention to diversity and systemic racial injustice and so on. It's not a real popular stance to say, hey, well, what about the guys? If you want to say, what about, black boys or Latino offenders that are going on parole? Like but generally speaking, saying, hey, men's issues, a lot of people will either overtly or, politely internally just kind of roll their eyes and be like, yeah, guys, I'll get the privilege anyway. To me, one of the concerning things about the current focus on toxic masculinity, there's an excellent quote, which I love, which basically says, the problem with stereotypes isn't that they're untrue. It's that they take part of the story and make it the whole story.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to just point out that the study of men's issues in psychology, that's just one little chunk of it, right? We've got family studies, we've got, nursing, we've got there's all sorts of different hands on the elephant of studying men, and sort of United States based psychology of men is just one of them. And so I encourage people that are interested in this to be aware of all these other elements of it. But when we talk about toxic masculinity, that's actually got a kind of curb appeal as a term, right? Media wise. So Ron Levant is thought leader in this area. And one of the points that I hope I'm quoting him correctly on this, is the term that he uses, and which, again, according to us sort of psych of men nerds, is more appropriate, is traditional, rigid masculinity ideology, which is accurate but terrible. It doesn't roll off the tongue in any way. And one of the ways that this played out, the APA released our guidelines, and Division 51, and a lot of folks on the Division 51 board and members alike were heavily involved in developing the APA's guidelines for the treatment of psychological treatment of boys and men. And I think it was like late 2019 that we released it. And briefly, one of the big issues that came up with the release of that document was a general perception of the stereotyping of masculinity as being problematic and negative. And certainly for the first of the movement and the research that I'm aware of in the first, like 20, 25 years of the psychological study of men, it was, what's wrong with this? Suicide, domestic violence, early graves, depression, issues which are still very, very important and which merit attention. But nobody was asking what's right with men. There really wasn't a strength. This is where my background in positive psychology and a strengths-based approach that balances where are the deficits and the issues with where are the strengths and what's really going well, I think is a nice fit for where the current study of masculinities is. And I say masculinities because we actually changed the name of the division to reflect basically an intersectional perspective on what masculinity is, that it's not just one kind of monolithic aspect of our identity. Like the part of my masculinity that I'm enacting with you right now on this podcast, trying to be articulate and funny and speaking the King's English and watching my language, like it's very different than what I'm doing when I'm playing poker with my buddies or hanging out at home with my kid or with my wife, right? So that's one element that I think is extremely important to bear in mind when we talk about what's generally called toxic masculinity. It refers to elements of masculinity that, like, so David and Brannon in the mid 70s did some really cool kind of cross-cultural work about what are the cardinal tenets of masculinity. And they boiled down to being, the first one is anti-femininity, which importantly does not mean you hate women. It means that whatever it is to be feminine in your culture, don't be that. Like be the opposite of that. So in that sense, that sort of rigid traditional kind of masculinity is very reactive and therefore very vulnerable and sensitive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other ones are, things that you would, being aggressive and, implied in that, or you'll shoot people or jump out of planes or be a sexual predator. You're independent and inexpressive. Nothing knocks you off your spot. And so when we talk about toxic masculinity, the way that I think of that is someone who adheres to a rigid sort of orthodox version of masculinity like that and does so inappropriately and overgeneral, because there are plenty of situations in which being that kind of traditional guy or very, very aggressive or taking charge of things is totally adaptive and appropriate. Like you don't want to talk about people's feelings when you're at war or boxing, right? So there are plenty of these. However, the issue is that most of the research in this area shows that by not having a more expanded version of the self that allows for partnership, accepting influence from people, emotional availability and expression, and so forth, that the guys that are only that stay within the guy box to avoid that shame of anti-femininity or being associated with anything feminine, they end up alone, depressed, they die younger, a lot of substance issues. Like, so it's more about that's not okay. It's not okay to be just that. And so the question you asked about treatment, I'm going to actually come up for air, but there are clear implications for the sorts of treatment that we do in psychotherapy with men.
It's just such a complexity within this area, as it is with, I think, any area that we're talking about when we're making, talking about identity and identity development. Gosh, it's definitely multifaceted, right? So as a multicultural psychologist, my mind goes to, okay, cultural identity, because white identity, I'm glad you brought that up, is an identity. And, there's origins to the perspective of this, and there's origins of the development of this, as well as, Black, Latinx, Asian, you name it, right? So there's definitely a lot of complexity that I can see in your description of, men, how the reaction, what is appropriate, this traditional role versus what we're seeing, I think, is a paradigm shift. I was actually talking to my husband about this recently, and we were watching, one of these Marvel shows, right? These Marvel movies, and you
Which
see
one?
these.
Which one?
I
Which
think it
movie?
was the Age of Ultron.
Sweet, because I can get going on
Oh, I bet.
masculinity. Banner wasn't able to turn back into the Hulk because he got shamed by Thanos and it was emasculating to him. I can do the men's issues Marvel thing like all day long.
There you
So this is
go.
my happy
Oh,
place.
I'm so excited.
All right.
And honestly, it was that one, but it was also, we've seen a series of them with, whether it's DC or whether it's Marvel. And one thing that's really interesting to me, and just kind of identifying as a woman, as a female, and seeing, kind of coming across a little bit of a paradigm shift from, the sociological and technological advancements we've made. I'm aging myself a little, but that's okay. I think it's a really cool paradigm shift to see men be allowed to be super strong, hyper masculine, so to speak. And I'm using these terms probably incorrectly, but this is just how I, my novice, self knows it,
Mm-hmm.
that now they're allowed to cry. They're allowed to, express emotions. I've seen, I think, Chris Evans, who plays Captain America. You've seen, Robert Downey Jr., who plays Iron Man, tearing up and having emotion and being able to express emotion. I remember watching films with my dad, love him to death, and he's got a military background, and that wasn't allowed. You see these films, and it was like John Wayne and like these old timey films, and it was like they didn't cry, they didn't express emotion. And I'm curious, what do you think about this paradigm shift? Or is it a paradigm shift? I don't know. But that men are allowed, quote unquote, allowed, because traditionally, as you said before, the roles were a little different. They're now able to transition into this place where they can be themselves, which to me is very exciting.
Yeah.
But I'm curious what you think about that, maybe this paradigm shift.
So I experience it both personally, but also with, friends and patients as being tricky. And so I used this term earlier, but I want to sort of fill it out a little bit. I see masculinities certainly in the United States, and broadly speaking in more westernized Western countries, as being not under attack, as you'll hear in different quarters reacting to this shift. I see it as under construction. And just from sort of a historical sociological perspective, I think that the current shifts and developments in men's role in society and masculinity more broadly is about 50 years behind where the women's liberation and feminist movements have shifted that of women at this point. Like, there are a lot of different, caveats that we could make there, but this hasn't really been a thing for anywhere near as long. And there are clear, benefits and governmental, organizational, societal forces at play that benefit a lot from keeping guys the same, keeping women the same, keeping people of all genders in their little boxes and corners. And so as men are now being given the opportunity to sort of lean into what was traditionally called, and I hate this term, their feminine side, as opposed to part of their humanity and part of their masculinity, it's very sort of bound, like geographically, this cultural group, this socioeconomic group. Like, I can't tell you how many. Like, I've worked with a number of African American guys that are like,
Mm-hmm.
I can't be depressed. I'm black. Either they thought it themselves or somebody told them that. And just that, like, to me, that's like as on the nose as you can get about this point, which is, yeah, you're seeing more out there. I love that you brought up Chris Evans. So my focus is on perinatal mental health and the early father, the dude to dad transition, and studying that. And there's this lovely, it's probably about a year and a half ago, example where, who is the most recent James Bond? I can't remember his
Is it Daniel Craig? Yeah.
Daniel Craig, right. So he's out in public wearing his baby, right? He's got like the baby Bjorn on, he's wearing his baby, and some British pundit like got going on him and was like, come on, James Bond, like, man up, who do you think you are? And Chris Evans jumped into the Twitter storm and was like, oh yeah, no, it's not cool to be a dad and involved with your, and really like laid into him. And I sat back and thought, this is Captain America standing up for James Bond's right to wear his baby. And that's the kind of world that I want to live in. And it is the kind of world that we're living in. And these things are shifting, albeit slowly. But that guy box, those rules about how to avoid shame, we all get them on the playground, and they're powerful and they're here. And as I say, it's tricky to try to navigate. Like, so where am I? Like, and it's different for millennials than it is for folks that are, currently, say, like my age, and navigating issues with their partners, because, we continue to evolve and develop as we move through our lives. And so I work with a lot of new dads that sort of like you're saying had that traditional like great Santini dad model, right? And interestingly, John Wayne was super involved with his babies. He completely changed diapers. He was not the Duke that we all think about. Like, he was actually really involved with his babies and his kids, which I love. It's just that wasn't what you saw in the media. But as these dads
Right.
are currently feeling the pressure,
Right.
I'm supposed to be more involved. Society thinks I'm going to be more involved, but I don't have the models for it. Then how to sort of navigate the boundaries of being a good team player, the potential like shame or embarrassment coming up of doing some of these traditionally feminized aspects of fatherhood is getting better, but we haven't really, like, it's still a thing to say, oh, a male nurse, or oh, a teacher, right? PE teacher. And so there are ways in which that we do this sort of gender stereotyping, certainly to women as well as to men and trans people and gender nonconforming, like all over the place. It's slowly shifting for men, but it's certainly not concretized. It's certainly not
Mm-hmm.
clean yet, I don't think. It may not ever be.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree with you. And, as I'm thinking and I'm hearing you talk I think it's not just men, it's also men's partners. I'm going to take a step back to focus for a quick second on heterosexual relationships, but I also do want to discuss gender nonconforming and homosexual relationships. But, these roles that have been expected, quote unquote, on both sides can be very conflicting as we're going through these shifts. And, I think for women as well, and I'll say, for women who identify as women, it does have a very big complexity to it. And I think it might be helpful to talk a little bit about how partners can support men and people who identify as men to get to their goals of being their authentic self, like whatever that looks like. What can partners do to provide support in this arena?
This is a good question. It's a big question.
Big question.
Yeah. At the broadest level, it starts with checking in the partners themselves with what's their bias? What are their biases about gender roles? About what is a man? Like, so I run, we here at the clinic, we run men's process groups. And if you ever want to get a men's group started, after you do the intros, just ask, what do you think it means to be a man and where did you learn that? And you, as the facilitator, can just kind of sit back. From the partner's perspective, stopping to ask really what are my assumptions? Like, what are my biases here? But also from the partner's perspective, and then what are the related needs that I have? Because the partner, him or herself, this isn't just sort of a cold clinical question. Like in the context of a romantic relationship, like an intimate partnership, this boils down to, and what does that mean about our needs and the fit in the relationship and the serve and return, and how we enact our relationship. And one key, sort of shifting the focus a little bit, one key element of this is like the worst kind of you people and sort of potentially like misandrist overstatement, but just hear me out on this one. In order to understand men who are struggling, be it clinically or in your life, it is really, really important to get what the roles of shame and vulnerability are to male identified people. And that comes from a long history of socialization and personal, familial, relational, and so forth. And I do lots of work with partners, with with gay couples, and we'll get into some of this about, does that, like, they'll be like, I don't get why he's doing blank. And I'm like, does that seem stupid to you? Does that just seem like anybody with common sense would know not to drink that way or run off and cheat or, try to, they'd be like, yeah, it kind of seems like common sense. I'm like, yeah, where do you think there might be some shame coming up here? Or how might this be just a really maladaptive way of trying to manage a sense of vulnerability that may not be all that clear to him that he even has it? Because remember, the function of the guy box, the function of being hard, being bad, being aggressive, nothing bugs you, is to avoid shame. That's what the role of that rigid traditional gender, masculine gender ideology, it is completely designed to keep the guy from feeling shame. And if you take that to an illogical extreme, you do stupid looking, very confusing things that to the guy are better than being shamed, than feeling shame. And that shame is a kind of vulnerability, but there are plenty of other ones. And certainly to the partners, what it's important for the partners to understand is
Mm-hmm.
he may not put this out there, but in an intimate partnership, the partner is probably the person to whom he is the most vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And managing the vulnerability in the relationship and the real threats and the confusing sort of difficulties that come up, that's what I would absolutely want partners to understand.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. I love that. I completely agree. And I'm so glad you brought up shame and vulnerability because I think there's not a single person that can't relate to that on some level. And, when we're in the midst of, some type of conflict or argument with our partners, again, kind of across, genders, we we don't understand sometimes. Sometimes we really don't get that the shame or the vulnerability that our partner is feeling and expressing and how they're feeling and expressing it and how they've identified it through socialization and through their own identity development in childhood as well. How they absorbed this and internalized what they believe they are supposed to be versus who they really are. And in some ways, that's kind of ironic, right? Because I think that's a very human experience, not just men, woman, gender nonconforming. We have that human element to trying to figure out who we are and how we learned these things and how that expression of ourselves affects our world and our family members, our loved ones. So yeah, this is very important. And as I sit here and I hear you, I like to identify myself as someone who I really appreciate how difficult, it is also for men as well as, men and people who identify as men and women who identify as women as well, that we're trying to live in a world where even though the traditional norms weren't working in a lot of ways, it was kind of understood and now we're shifting it. So as you said, I think I like that you said, and I may be paraphrasing, under construction. That we're and that can be really hard. When we're under construction, that's a lot of times where
Mm-hmm.
we have confusion, arguments, things where we're still trying to get rid of the old and onto the new, and we don't know necessarily how to do that. So I'm very appreciative of the way you're describing this and how important it is for us to connect and understand our partners and do so with the intention of getting to know that part of us that has that shame and vulnerability. It makes me think a little bit of Brene Brown. Um, and yeah, I just think that's so relevant.
Yeah, yeah. As I say, I have people watch Brene Brown YouTube videos
Yeah,
all the time.
yeah. I think she's just a pioneer in this field, and she's really brought it to the mainstream, which is so important because it really is such an these are underlying topics that affect us in every which way. But yeah, I think this is wonderful. There's so many people that can benefit from, understanding themselves, especially men, in this shifting paradigm. How do they feel about this? How do they feel about themselves? And I'm curious, how do men or people who are curious about their own internal issues or identify as men, how do they find somebody like you, an expert, where they can go and, talk about this and work through some of their concerns?
Uh, you mean in terms of like psychological work, or
Like someone with a specialization in men's issues. Yes, exactly. So, because sometimes it's hard for people to find, you have such a niche here, and it can be difficult, I think, for people to find to find you.
yeah? So this is going to sound like, okay, sure, the men's issues guy thinks everybody doesn't appreciate him. Fine. One key point here, and I do a lot of trainings and organizational work with folks, but like when I get a group of people, I like to ask the question. So, by a show of hands, who in the room has had any focused training on men's issues? And rarely, like, Vic Frazeo teaches one, although even less frequently now over at Alliant, but very, very rarely. And I bring that up just so, I expect that listeners to your podcast are likely to be in mental health or psychology. And so the seed that I want to plant here is, sure, the history of psychology was run by a bunch of white dudes that thought they knew it all. And the field is growing up. And that doesn't mean that learning the nuances of men's issues and masculinities isn't important. Like, imagine if I showed up and said, like, yeah, I can work with kids, no problem. I've known lots of kids in my life. I never studied anything, I never took any training about them, but yeah, sure, I can work with kids. That's the scope of practice issue. That's an ethical issue. But we'd say that about men, for example, as a group study. Like, people don't frame it that way. However, I see it as an ethical point, as a scope of practice. And if you're working with men, don't assume that men are all the same, or that, yeah, I got it, I've worked with, more men than you've had hot dinners. Go take a CE on it. Go actually do some work to learn about, like, do you know about alexithymia and male manifestations of different, masked male depression or MDD male type, or these sorts of things. So that's, to me, that's one really, really important point, just as a seed I'm trying to plant with folks that might be listening. Now I got all worked up though. What was the original question? Squirrel. Okay, I'm back.
I love what you just said.
Yeah.
That's great.
What?
Squirrel.
Something shiny.
That's good. No, you're right. As far as mental health providers, something shiny. You're right though. As far as mental health professionals, and I'm reflecting even in my own training. I agree. I don't recall having much, if anything, that it comes to mind as far as specificity towards men's concerns, men's issues, and men identity development. I actually learned a lot of that in my post educational forum, where I, as a multicultural psychologist, I did have to dive into that and wanted to in many ways. But yeah, it's not something that's taught just right off the bat. It's not a specific thing. So I think that's where the specialization.
It's like Gero, right?
Yeah. Right. Like,
when
gerontology.
you take a developmental psych class, do you ever learn about Gero?
Right.
No, it's a total blind spot in the field, much of the detriment of a lot of baby boomers that need some shrinking about now.
Yes. Which is important that
but I digress.
No, you're good. I think that keeps it in that well-rounded spectrum. So yeah, no, my original question, but yes, I love the squirrel tangent. That was perfect. Yeah. How do people find people with specializations like you, mental health providers like you? Yes.
Right. Beyond just the Google machine, right? Like, they can find us at our website, Center for Men's Excellence.
Yeah.
There's also, if you go on like a resource like SDPA,
great.
Like, we have our find a clinician service, which I think has a men's issues data point on it. You can certainly go to Psychology Today. My bias is and always will be to look for folks that do evidence-based work. And so if there's a specific modality that you're looking for, but I get these questions all the time, because it's not like there's some well-identified network of, where do you find? So a lot of times it'll be like, somebody will just ask me and I'll put it out to like the Division 51 listserv. Hey, do you know anybody good in Lincoln or something? And it tends to be more informal than that. But for folks that are, I say this sort of over optimistically, for those folks that, in a pandemic and with all that's going on in terms of politics and racial justice and so forth, like the people looking for mental health resources has exploded. And I personally have been horrified by how difficult it is to find anyone that's taking on patients, and that about 50% of the time, they just don't call you back.
Yeah,
they don't call you back to say we don't have openings. They don't call you back to say anything. It's just, but enough of that soapbox. What I like to do personally is I want to talk to the, like, I'll say, they say they do men's issues, or they say, focus on boys, for example. Chris Miller is a psychologist here in town that does phenomenal works, and he's specifically focused on like boys and like tween and teen. It's a phenomenal niche. He does great work. But what I would want to do is actually call and talk to him and say, where are you coming from with this? Like, and if it is masculinity or male identification that's part of it, I would include that for me as the mental health consumer. What's your experience with this? What's your background? Do you do much of this? And include that, because there's not like just one sort of centralized, like, here's where you go for men's issues kind of thing.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think that's a good point to clinicians. Really highlight that you have this expertise, and that it is well rounded, right? Because we're talking about men's issues, but that also encompasses, LGBTQ plus, members. That also encompasses people of diversity. So this is important to highlight these strengths so that way people can find you. And you brought up a lot of great, places to do that. And, for yourself, that you are here in San Diego and working at the Center for Men's Excellence. I think that's fantastic. So, Dr. Singley, I want to thank you so much for your time. This has been wonderful to talk to you today. I feel like I've learned some tidbits here that I definitely want to make sure I incorporate and keep in mind as well. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Just briefly, my overall perspective here is developmental, and to me, the idea is I want folks to understand that if we build stronger boys, we don't have to fix broken men. And in order to do that, we got to take the time and we got to see those boys for more than traditionally what we have. And to further understand that male privilege is 100% a thing, and it's alive and well.
Mm-hmm.
And to understand that male identified people do not have equal access to it. A bisexual Latino male does not have the same access to male privilege as a rich white dude, as does a gay HIV black man. And so when we start looking at toxic masculinity and thinking in terms of broad brushes, I strongly encourage people to come back to a more intersectional perspective that looks for multidimensionality, that looks for nuance. And I think an important part for us as psychologists and as clinicians, like when Kimberly Crenshaw was talking about a lot of her initial work in intersectionality, what she was looking to do was, in critical race theory, make the invisible visible.
Mm-hmm.
And male privilege tends to be invisible to the males. And so I see a very, very important part of doing this work. How do we not just get bogged down in you have privilege, I don't,
Mm-hmm.
but how do I understand the ways that you are empowered and disempowered? Who are you from a culturally humble perspective to me? And then how do we maybe help to make your invisible more visible so we can be better humans together, better, therapist and patient, just whatever. But I think teaching boys about their masculinity and what it means and what it can mean is one of the best gifts that we can give those boys, but society as a whole in the long run.
I could not agree more. And I think that was the perfect statement to talk about this topic and wrap up our conversation today. I so agree with that. And thank you again so much, Dr. Singley. I really appreciate you being here and hoping to have you come back soon.
Thanks for having me. I would be happy to.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. The information and advice offered is not intended to treat or diagnose and is not meant to replace any other professional consultation. If you'd like to know more about the San Diego Psychological Association, go to our website at sdpsych.org. That's sdpsych.org. Thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, take care of yourself and be well.